Okay. So for short-term memory, if I was to piece this out, there are about 7 thoughts you can have at one time. We have not defined what 7 thoughts really mean, if it's like a huge amount of data or short bits, but 7 thoughts at one time, typically between 5 or 9 thoughts, or is a scale. And the thoughts that have high importance stay. Usually about 30 seconds before it gets, because it's cycling through your brain. I think it's probably right here in the front area, behind the cortex area. It cycles through the brain over and over again until it's then removed. But how is it removed? It's removed through a process of importance. So basically, based on emotion and identity, those things connect together in the process of thought and attention. So when you are, for example, you're reading a book and you're keeping tags on what you've been reading. It's kind of where your short-term memory is. And soon as you lose one thing that seems no longer important, similar to the LSTM system that we talked about earlier, it drops it. And then automatically, the most important thing comes up top of the list. So you kind of have things ordered. And you keep doing that process continuously, nonstop. So long-term memory is different from short-term memory because in the short-term memory, long-term memory, you're able to, every connection in your brain is stored. You don't lose anything, technically. Of course, there is erosion through your neurons decaying over time or whatever like that. But assume that they were fixed, they will stay there forever. And how do they get there? The hippocampus, or how this works is, whenever you have any kind of sensory input come into your brain, and it goes to your short-term memory, has some level of importance through emotion, spatial recognition, then it's sent to your hippocampus area, where it's now been encoded, the term we used earlier, to mean that now it's been encoded and compressed. So the process of learning something, or the process of taking in information and going through the brain is encoded. That's the memory, not a physical thing. It's the process that it went through is now stored as a memory. And that memory is stored in some kind of encoding in the hippocampus. So what are the different types of long-term memory? There's procedural and declarative, and then declarative have 2 types, semantic and episodic. The procedural memory, for example, is something you can't teach, like ride a bike, or those are mechanical systems your physical body can't do. This is the same thing that AGI would have to do. We can't teach AGI to ride a bike. We have to put it into an environment. And here is the physics in the world. You can use a simulation tool. What tool did you use again? The tool you use? You said you use?
I mean, I'm using Unreal Engine and...
Yeah, Unreal Engine.
Yeah.
Actually, the Unreal Engine is actually a pretty good engine to use simulations in real-world situations because they have a lot of physics in it.
Oh, yeah, there's PhysX that people use for that kind of thing.
Yes. If you were to build some kind of system, stick it into this environment, and then apply the physics of the world, create a bike, they'll develop a bike in there that's supposed to ride and do all the things and fall over or whatever like that. If you were to push this AGI system into it and go through regular physics, it would have to learn how to ride a bike if that's the goal. So that's the physical part. Now, semantic, which is declarative memory, is knowledge about anything. It's basically not about myself, but just knowledge that there's a chair or the chair is blue. That is semantic memory. So basically, whenever I go and remember these things, I remember these things through a graph or an association, connection to each other. These connections don't have time. They don't have some kind of space. That just is in the memory. And they are something that I use by knowing, like for example, if I was to say, okay, I want to connect knowing, Bob and everything that's connected to Bob. Remember that spinning thing I showed earlier about how things are evolving? The connections that's closest to that specific item will be everything relevant to it. So for example, Bob, and I could think about the 10, 15 different things related to Bob. Like you might say, I remember the guy's name. And you know the person, you can identify in your head who you're talking about, but you don't know who that person is. Then you might have the association between the person, the name, and different parts to triangulate to get the actual name. So semantic memory kind of does all of that for you, which is kind of, I mentioned down here, back here, is kind of similar to what Word2Vec kind of uses. All right, moving forward. Episodic memory. Episodic memory is different from the other one. What it does is it remembers everything about myself. It's kind of self-implicit, focused on things in my specific lifestyle. So memories of me wake up this morning to memories of me going to sleep. That's a conscious state of mind. So the episodic memory goes through, remembers the emotion, the space that I was in, because it has to have spatial recognition, the time, everything that's going on. Those things are memorized. Things about self are in the episodic memory. So again, I said memory storage is not physical. Everything overall, if you would say memory was a root of these different components I mentioned, is just if I have some signal coming through my eyes, ears, or whatever signal that I have come through, it processes through and goes and stores that process. Even the thoughts that I have through the day that has nothing to do with what I see or hear are still processed through the brain and reconfigured and then stored. So you think through the course of the day, you have thousands of thoughts. And we'll talk about that too later on. All those thoughts are being stored. Even if you think good things or bad things, those things are still being stored and to your memory as well. And that process, the neural network, saves it, and that memory is then saved, even if it's your thoughts. If I go back to it again, the episodic memory is not just what I see in the world around me, but it's also what's internal. So everything that you currently think about is also saved in the episodic memory. So back to neurons. I mentioned earlier the dendrite, cell body, axon, synapses. These are things that make up the actual physical connections between in the brain. We're going to get in a little deeper about how this works. So there's something called axon potential. What happens is when the dendrites send all the information through the brain, it channels it through, and there's some sodium, potassium, and calcium that goes through these different chambers and floods through and pushes along that current all the way down, or the charge that is, all the way down the axon potential, or the axon, all the way down to the synapse. Be mindful that the way that neural networks work, artificial neural networks, we keep weights. But in the brain, we have something called the axon potential. Does not just, because you have weights, it turns on. As a matter of fact, what it does is it's a spike. So if it meets or exceeds negative 55 millivolts within that particular axon, or that connection to the cell body, what it does is it then sends up and hits that polarization over there. You can see it up top over there. And that's the spike. And sends that signal down the axon all the way to the synapse. Here's the synaptic cleft. Here's where the calcium comes in. And here's the synaptic vesicles. These are neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters then send this information to the next neuron. So the bottom part is a different neuron where those are the dendrites that are accepting, have receptors that accept the new transmitters. The transmitters are information, in lack of better words, is sending a particular information from one neuron to the next. And from macro scale, it's the connection going across the brain and happening super fast. It's sending information on from next to the next. All right, so what's the point of all this? The point of all of me talking about the neurotransmitters and getting into the brain and the components of how all this stuff works is that the AGI will always have to be built somewhere or be built similar to how the human is. Now, there's a lot of theories out there that some people say, you can't build it the same way as a human. We should try something different. But a lot of our advancements have been because we did things similar to the human way, the whole neural networks system. I agree with it and don't agree with it. I agree with it to some degree because a lot of the core processes, functions that we use, emotional, the limbic system, a lot of things that we do, recognition from seeing, hearing, and everything that we have used is based on recognition, which uses neural networks. But new knowledge, new things that we have not figured out, we will have to use something a little more higher base, which I mentioned earlier, which we use regression and some kind of statistical knowledge. So neurotransmitters, there's like I think 12 types of different neurotransmitters. These are what actually constitutes different feelings and emotions. So again, they come down, they send it to the next neuron, and then passed on, and this happens through a huge array. Any questions? No? Okay. All right, so synaptic gap is just the area between the end of the previous cell and the beginning of the next one. That's where they flow through and hit it. And if there's enough of the neurotransmitters that get onto the next neuron and it is charged up enough, it will send the axon potential across, that I mentioned earlier. All right, I'm not going to go into too deep with this because this is getting even deeper. Here is the different types of transmitters. If you didn't know, this actually helps with different types of situations you go on in your life. So for example, if you were to, and these neurotransmitters are transmitted through the brain. These are actually the emotional receptors you actually feel through emotion. This is not part of your endocrine system, but this is part of your neurotransmitter in the brain. And it allows you to be able to have fight or flight, if you've heard of these, or concentration, or learning, or calming, or memory transmitters. These are sent along, and these are nothing more than the chemicals. They're chemical based. They are charged.